Biafra Britain's Shame by Auberon, Waugh and Susanne Cronjé. Introduction. After the main part of this book was written, several events occurred which tended to clarify Britain's policy in the war between Nigeria and Biafra, a policy which the United States was apparently ready to condone long after the official Red Cross estimate of mortality through starvation reached 1.5 million. This figure was comprised almost exclusively of civilians, mostly children. Long after, also the president of the Red Cross had condemned those countries supplying arms with a suggestion that all the oil in Nigeria would not provide detergent enough to wash the blood from their hands. On June 5, 1969, a Swedish Red Cross plane was shot down in broad daylight over Calabar province by a jet fighter of the Federal Nigerian Air Force. Nobody at any stage suggested that this action was a mistake, and in the House of Commons debate of July 10th, Mr. Hull Fraser, a former Secretary of State for Air, produced evidence to show that the fighter was acting under direct and explicit instructions from Lagos. Initially, the action was justified by the suggestion that the plane had been carrying arms, but this claim was later withdrawn, being retained only for domestic consumption within Nigeria. Shortly after this event, the federal government announced that it would take over all responsibility for coordinating relief supplies in both sides of the fighting lines, and that it would only allow relief into unoccupied Biafra subject to certain conditions, that all such flights were inspected on federal territory and flee from Lagos, or initially from Calabar into Biafra, that all such flights took place by day, and that they flew into Uli Airport and not into any demilitarized airstrip specially built for the purpose. It was never clear from the statement either of British or of Nigerian spokesmen. By now, the official statement had become identical, whether a further condition would be the demilitarization of Uli Airport, thereby severing the Biafran government's last link with the outside world for official government business and for the arrival of material necessary to continue the war. If so, of course, acceptance of these conditions would have been tantamount to surrender, but negotiations never reached that stage. The Nigerian government was not prepared to accept the suggestion that federal inspection should take place on neutral territory, insisting that supplies should come from Nigeria, since this would mean that all relief would be subject to Nigerian control and liable to delay or complete cessation at the will of the federal government, quite apart from the enormous military advantage liable to be gained if at any stage these relief flights from federal territory were abused and put to military purpose. The Biafrans refused to accept them. This, of course, was just what Mr. Michael Stewart, the British Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, had been waiting for. In two of the most obsequious performances ever staged by a foreign secretary on the floor of the House of Commons, Hansard July 7th and July 10th, 1969, he laid all the blame for the starvation of 1.5 million Biafran civilians fair and square on the Biafrans themselves, most particularly on their leader, General Odumegwu Ojukwu, whom he insisted on regarding as the man responsible for the entire war. The position, therefore, is that the Nigerian government are ready to let relief go through on conditions which are in themselves reasonable and are acceptable to the relief agencies at the Lagos conference. This was later denied by the relief agencies concerned. The only reason why it, a hypothetical relief plane in Lagos, could not go in would be General Ojukwu's objection. I hope most earnestly that in the light of his responsibility for the people now under his control, he will reconsider this. But I must say again, and this puts some of us Europeans to shame, that the Nigerian government have a more merciful attitude about allowing food and medical supplies to go to their enemies than have many other nations. Finally, on July 10th, having assured the House that General Gowon, in conversation recently with the High Commissioner in Lagos, said explicitly, and he stated that he would be glad for this to be known, that he did not regard starvation as a legitimate weapon. Mr. Stewart went to say, I cannot therefore give the House to understand that the federal government will be willing to go further than they have already said in the matter of relief. It never seemed to occur to the Foreign Secretary in his role as public relations spokesman for the Gowon regime in Lagos that others might doubt the sincerity of his little protege. Mr. Stewart described the Nigerians' supposed willingness to allow relief under certain conditions as one of the massive and solid facts in the whole situation. An even more massive and solid fact in the entire situation, of course, was that according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, 1.5 million Biafrans had already been starved to death. Another massive and solid fact was that in 2 years of war, the federal government had never yet voluntarily allowed so much as a bag of powdered milk into unoccupied Biafra, despite protestations that it was prepared to do so under certain circumstances. A third massive and solid fact was that the federal government, for the first time, reportedly in a position to stop relief effectively through the acquisition of new Ilyushins with East German pilots and a Russian raider ship situated in the Bight of Biafra, had immediately taken advantage of the extent of shooting down a Red Cross plane and forcing a halt on all Red Cross relief operations. A fourth massive and solid fact was that a few days before, on June 26th and June 27th, Chief Awolowo, the vice chairman of the military government and Gowon's deputy, had publicly announced, "All is fair in war and starvation is one of the weapons of war," adding, "I do not see why we should feed our enemy fat in order to fight us harder." He was followed a day later by Brigadier Hassan Katsina, the commander-in-chief of the Nigerian army, who put himself on record as being totally opposed to the supply of relief material to the rebels, saying, "I will not feed somebody I am fighting." Chief Enahoro, whose somewhat checkered career had finally brought him to the post of Commissioner for Information and Labor inside the Nigerian cabinet, had repeatedly put himself on record in similar terms. To anyone with the slightest knowledge of Nigerian politics and of the interests which had brought Gowon to power and were maintaining him there, the truth would have been immediately apparent. That even if one was prepared to accept the sincerity of Gowon's protestations on the subject of relief without the slightest evidence beyond intuition to support such a belief, he did not have the political power to implement them. That Nigeria had persistently been engaged in siege tactics to supplement military activity against those whom she chose to regard as her enemies, and that as her military efforts became less effective, her reliance upon the weapon of starvation proportionately increased. In this context, it is relevant to observe that those people to whom Chief Awolowo, Brigadier Katsina, Chief Enahoro, and Mr. Michael Stewart referred bleakly as Nigerians' enemy were the same as those who, according to the Nigerian case, had been misled into supporting secession and who wanted nothing more than to be received back into Nigeria. In order to facilitate this happy state of affairs, for 2 years the Nigerian government had been prepared to wage the most bitter war in the history of West Africa and had been prepared to starve to death 1.5 million of those whom it regarded as being its own citizens. The British case for supporting the Nigerian cause rested strongly upon its legality. Nobody bothered to point out that the Gowon regime derived its existence from a military coup, that not a single Nigerian voter had ever, at any stage, cast a vote in its favor, that the Nigerian people had never been consulted on any single item of its policy, from the fact of the military government to the 12-state partition of Nigeria to the ruinous war which, with Britain's support, was driving a final nail into the coffin of the Federation. Nor were the apologists for Nigerian action ever able to explain what law it is which gives a government, however impeccable its claims to legality, the right to execute 1.5 million of those whom it believes to be its citizens in order to force them into an association which they manifestly wish to leave. 1.5 million civilians' death, deliberately encompassed within a single national, ethnic, or racial group constitutes the crime of genocide by any existing legal definition. The original intention behind the Nigerian invasion of Biafra was certainly not genocidal, but the stark fact remains that both the federal Nigerian government and the British government were prepared to condone the use of genocide as a means to winning that war and maintaining the unity of Nigeria along the frontiers, which were determined in 1914 as a result of some world's haphazard military situation between the French and the English in the 1890s. These boundaries embrace the Muslim feudal peoples of the north and the thriving Christian democratic communities of the South within a single framework, with nothing whatever to keep them together beyond a temporary, shifting interpretation of reciprocal interest. When that was removed, there was nothing left but military force. It is easy to understand the Gowon's regime's motive for resorting to this, even to understand that a young nation, feeling itself on the verge of disintegration, might resort to desperate measures in order to preserve its territorial integrity. None of these considerations, however, can ever begin to explain why it was that the British government, for the first time in its history, was prepared to condone genocide as a means of implementing an extremely minor item of its foreign policy. This book offers a number of explanations: the absence of any effective parliamentary opposition, the personal characteristics of the Foreign Secretary, and the circumstances in which his advice came to be held in such high regard within the cabinet, the pro-Nigerian inclinations of many Commonwealth Office civil servants, the English business interest based in Lagos, the fear of a Russian presence in West Africa, above all, or at any rate growing in importance as the war dragged on, the oil in Midwestern Nigeria and the south of Biafra. All this contributed in part. At the time of writing, August 1969, it seems that a dawning awareness of the oil companies, Shell BP being the most heavily involved and the most directly implicated, that the war is not susceptible to a quick kill, might be the instrument to bring about a change in British policy. In July, it was known that Nigerian oil production had fallen by 100,000 barrels a day. One was reluctant to believe that hard-headed businessmen were as likely to be taken in by dreams of a reunited Nigeria, living in peace and harmony after the most ferocious civil war in African history, as were the mandarins of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the nation's political leaders. All that remained was to convince the oil interest not only that they were unlikely to see a profitable return for the investment while the war lasted, but also that a Nigerian military victory, the capture of all the towns, main roads and Uli airports, would never create conditions in which their investment was secure, and in which the oil could flow without constant harassing operations and sabotage from Biafran guerrillas. Once the oil companies could be convinced of this important fact, it would only be a matter of time before the policy of the British government switched behind the advocacy of a peaceful solution rather than the support of Nigerian war aims. But it will remain a stupefying commentary on the state of British politics towards the end of the 7th decade of the 20th century that moral considerations were never allowed to play the smallest part in the determination of British policy, that the British public and Parliament were prepared to allow the starving of over 1 million children to death in order to further some marginal and problematic interpretation of our national self-interest. There were many reasons given for the course of action on which Mr. Michael Stewart found himself set. That we were the traditional suppliers of arms to the Nigerian government. We were not. That the war would soon be over. It was never likely to have been. That essential British interests were involved. They were not. That the Biafran people were unwillingly led to secession by a ruthless, ambitious clique. This was the exact opposite of the truth. That the Russians would take over Nigeria if we did not. There was never any danger of this, although the longer the war lasted, the more possible it became. that other secessionist pressure groups in Africa would receive encouragement from a successful Biafran breakaway, it would not have altered the circumstances of any such pressure in the slightest way. But the real reason why this disgusting episode in British history was allowed to occur was surely nothing to do with our having an incompetent foreign secretary or an ineffective political opposition. These are nothing new. The reason was that the British people, and above all the British intelligentsia, had ceased to have any interest or concern in the conduct of our foreign affairs. Having lost an empire after a tolerably honorable period of stewardship, and with tolerably good grace, the British people had abdicated from all responsibility on world affairs, leaving it to a handful of men about whose competence, reliability, or simple human decency they were totally indifferent. It is no great joy for an Englishman to record it, but for as long as our complicity in the genocide of 1.5 million Biafrans remain undebated and unpunished, it is impossible to believe that Britain will ever again be fit for a world role.